Hi, my name is Nancy Bartlett, and I want to introduce to you a wonderful film documentary called Community in Conflict. It's the story of how a committee worked with the members of the Santa Fe City Council to get a marker to denote where men in World War II who are of Japanese descent were sent. They were considered to be dangerous enemy aliens by virtue of being born Japanese. No man was ever arrested for being a spy, but they were along the western coast of the United States, and the government was afraid that they would become spies because they were leaders in their community. So the men that were sent to the Santa Fe camp, 4,555 over the 4 years, were initially men who were not allowed to become citizens, but had lived in the United States for at least 17 years. And they were either planning to be here forever with their families or to earn their wealth and then take it back to Japan. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, these men, almost 2,000 Japanese men, were arrested by the FBI or the US Navy. And Santa Fe was one of the places that had a CC camp, which was vacated now because our boys were being sent over to the Pacific to fight for us. And they were sent to Santa Fe and other camps in New Mexico, right in the shadow of the atomic bomb secret. And General Groves knew about it, was a secret. It was in the Santa Fe city limits, but it also was a secret to many people living in Santa Fe. And the guards were hired from men living in Santa Fe who were in need of income. So this is a story of the conflict of putting a marker to denote where the camp was with the people who were related or lost loved ones in the Bataan Death March. And Claudia Katayanagi from California, from Sacramento area, has interviewed people who from both sides and put together a 45-minute documentary. And it's not being shown with this event right now, but we hope to bring it back sometime this summer. But in the meantime, what we will show you is the discussion that followed, and a panel discussion with two of us who were on the committee, Dr. Tom Chavez, who at that time was director of the State History Museum in Santa Fe, and myself, and then Claudia and Charles Martinez, who represents, he's a historian for the New Mexico National Guard, who became prisoners of the Japanese for 4 years in the Philippines. And it was a lively discussion we had, and we hope that you will become very interested in this subject and will come back to Sala that provided us this free time because we're members of Sala to show this film and also to bring it back. And thank you very much for listening. I'm Nancy Bartlett, historian of World War II. After the Oppenheimer movie, I was the one that answered questions about the movie. Also with John Reminer, we gave a talk twice in this theater about the decision to drop the atomic bombs. And I put a book out, Silent Voice of World War II, in 2005, and I've been remiss in not getting it back into the market because it talks about the interaction between the Navajo code talkers, the Bataan Death March, the Santa Fe internment camp, which General Groves knew was being built, and in the shadow of Los Alamos, which was the biggest secret of World War II. And so I talk about those 4 stories.
And I have family in Hiroshima.
And she has a family in Hiroshima. So anyway, you all know me because I'm always in the newspaper and pictures. And you know how to get a hold of me. And I will be giving a talk on the Japanese response to the atomic bombing drop and the Russian invasion, and why it took so long for them to surrender, with John Hopkins, who's going to talk about the Japanese research of nuclear weapons during World War II. And that's May 14th over at Fuller Lodge for the Historical Society. So I guess, Claudia, it's your turn, and would you, and Charlie is here, and we're informal, and please, and
Yeah, I want.
you go ahead.
Well, what is your reaction to the film generally, if you have any?
Really nicely done, very, very.
Yeah, very well done.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to give the Bataan veterans side of the story. I really could. I wanted to. I had Margaret Garcia was going to be part of the panel, but she apparently has family issues. But I think we should provide a little more historical context, and here we have, why don't you?
She doesn't want to talk much, throws it to me.
No, you were the authority.
I always begin this when talking about what happened, with the subject of the film, and I love to point out that the whole thing originated in a museum. It didn't originate in city council or the governor's office or anything. It was a state history museum where I happened to be the director at that time. And, what got it going was an article I was writing for the New Mexican. I had every other week, I guess, I'd write an article about some forgotten part of history. And this was one of them. And the reason I came up with that, because I had some background knowledge of internment camps, having grown up in California, and an experience with my dad and his friends. We won't get into that unless you ask me. So at the library there at the State History Museum, we'd get occasional questions about the internment camp. And as you heard Jolando say in the film, there was nothing there. And I thought that was kind of odd because I knew there was an internment camp in Santa Fe. So I decided that we needed to get a committee together to the first idea was to start collecting information about the camp to have in the library, so when people wanted to do the research, like a student, for example, they'd have a place to go to get the information. But that quickly, because of the article I wrote, in the article I said, wouldn't it be great if we had a marker? I actually wrote that in New Mexican, and that's what really turned the subject matter from collecting information to putting up a marker. The whole process, when you watch movies and read history, sometimes we telescope things, but it took 4 years from the day we started to the day the city council passed it. It was a long process, and I was very much aware, because I am a historian, I knew about the Bataan March. I knew that we had survivors of the Bataan March. My dad at that time was a survivor. He was a World War II veteran. He wasn't in the Bataan March. He was in the Marine Corps and actually fought Japanese and island hopped and ended up in Guam. And then in China, ironically in China, protecting Japanese prisoners from the Chinese. And then trying to get them back to Japan before the Chinese got to them. And so it was this whole irony. One other little connection between Los Alamos, we're in Los Alamos. My dad was a teenager when the war broke out. And one of the first jobs he had in high school, just when he was getting in high school, was taking ice to the Japanese internment camp. The second job he got, quickly after that, was when his dad, my grandfather, a carpenter, who built houses, some of which still exist in Santa Fe, was hired to build the structures here at Camp Oppenheimer. And so my dad became a runner for Robert Oppenheimer. Then he's in the Marine Corps protecting, island hopping, survives that. Then he's protecting Japanese prisoners from Chinese, and the bomb went off and he came home. So history's like throwing a rock into a pond and watching the concentric circles ripple out one after the other. The influence of one event has such an impact in so many different ways and so many, over time even. So this is one of those events. I'm proud, always was proud then to be a part of it. We knew there was going to be controversy because the 2 battalions that left New Mexico that became part of the Bataan Death March, it was very prominent, and there were many survivors then. I think they're probably all gone now. There was one a couple of years ago. I think he probably passed. One more? Okay. So we knew that, and there wasn't anybody in our committee that didn't understand that, didn't have empathy for that. And that's one of the points of all of this. It wasn't like, oh, those dirty rats, how could they oppose us? They're just ignoramuses and that. We understood why they felt like they felt. And even more so, their children and descendants. Some of them felt stronger about it than the men themselves did, because the men were elders now, and the kids wanted to protect the elders. So that went on, and there was two points that we found was points of opposition to us. One was that these are Japanese, these are Japs, these were our enemy. They were the bad people. Well, they were for the Bataan marchers, but the idea that Japanese Americans fought in World War II in the United States Army was beyond the pale for some of them. They just could not believe that. It was really hard for them to grasp that. And, I was told point blank that you're lying to me, Tom. No. On the other hand, and I brought this up the other day, it wasn't us against veterans. As you saw in the film, Joe Ando's a retired colonel in the United States Air Force. So was Doc Weaver, a retired colonel in the United States Air Force. I'm just a retired corporal in the Army, but I'm a veteran nonetheless, And so the 3 main people on that committee were veterans as well. And so it was even hard for some people to understand that Joe Ando was a veteran at the time. So part of the process is education. Not telling them, well, we're right and you're wrong, but here's examples. And I believe to this day, one of the things that turned the tide for us, because I was thinking about this last night, there were stages that went on. One was just the idea of doing this and we thought it was right. Then the opposition came. And I'll be frank with you, we were surprised by that too. We understood it, but we were surprised by it. And then so there was this whole kind of battle for the public's backing, to get them to understand. The papers were running articles and stuff, and they're interviewing me, and all of that. And the one guy with the medals and stuff, incidentally, was not a Bataan marcher. I need to say that. I wasn't ridiculing a Bataan marcher. He never left the States in his military service. His service was it was horrible. He went to Florida. Just awful. Very dangerous too. And so we had those kinds of people coming, him telling me in my office that we put that marker up, he's going to urinate on it, and everything. That was pretty heavy stuff, Never got threatened with death, fortunately, and get these phone calls. But on the other hand, I had at least 2 of the marchers back then call me personally because they knew me. I've been in my position for a long time. And they told me that actually they weren't in opposition, but they couldn't come out and say so for fear of hurting the feelings of somebody else. Perfectly understandable. And I told them that. And so that was going on. The thing that turned it for me was when Joe Andel showed shared his photos of the camp that I guess he got from his father, and there was that photo of the Army soldier, Japanese American, at his father's funeral at the camp. And I got the New Mexican to publish it on the front page. And that turned the tide. I really, we could just sense it then. And because one of my jobs as head of the whole thing was to deal with the politics of it. And I would, rustle up Joe or Doc to be my operatives on occasion. But I had met with all the city councilors. In fact, I knew some of them even before they were city councilors. And had to, explain to them what we're doing and this and that. Most of them understood that the history was correct, but they were still, as you saw, kind of worried about what they're going to do to the feelings in their community and how that's going to react to them. And of course, we know politicians are legends in their own minds. Some politicians don't want to, even if they knew the history, they wouldn't acknowledge it. And so, but that city council was a pretty good council. They really did take the time to consider both sides and all sides and what they were trying to do. I felt going into there were 2 city council meetings, incidentally. The first one went in, and Patty Boucher, who always backed it, she's the one in the film, figured out that we might lose the vote that day. So she got the thing tabled. And it was at that one where I got up and represented our side and gave a big speech about history and saying I find it impossible that a town like Santa Fe would ignore its own history. Of all the cities in this country, how could Santa Fe ignore its own history? And that got some people going. But so she tabled it, and then the second one came up, and that's when Larry Delgado, who was a really good mayor in his day, broke the tie. So that's it in a nutshell.
But Tom, you talked about the Confederates who were buried in the National Cemetery. And
Yes.
that was, to me, that was one of the things that I listened to and I was impressed by, and I thought others would be impressed by.
All right, so when I presented our side before the city council, I brought up the whole thing is, we talk about a community divided, but during the Civil War, and recently, and I was part of that at the Museum of New Mexico, there were the remains of Confederate soldiers found at Glorieta. I don't know if any of you remember that. It was a mass site of the remains, and then there was one set aside, and that was Captain Shropshire. And we could identify him from his remains and what was, his ring and different things. Incidentally, his remains were taken and buried in a family plot in Kentucky. And so that created a little bit of a rift, not like this one, but we decided that those remains we'd have them lay in state in one of the rooms at the museum, and then they would be taken in a carriage to the National Cemetery and buried with the other Union soldiers that are there. And so there are Confederate soldiers in our cemetery. And I brought that up for the city council. I says, if we can do something like that, surely we can put up a marker for an internment camp that we know existed.
And Carol Lopez broke her arm 10 days ago and just had surgery. I had finished being on the county council and mayor of Los Alamos, and because I taught in Japan, I was invited to join the committee. I didn't have a constituent, I didn't have people to lobby, but that night when the 8 councilors spoke, I was so impressed with our democracy, and you only saw a little bit of what each councilor said. But Carol changed her mind. She was going to vote against the marker because of what she said in the film, that she didn't want to do anything respectful of her elders. And she had gone to Spain with family who sons who'd been on the Bataan Death March. But she said she couldn't sleep the night before. She walked up and down the hall. She had an 11-year-old son, maybe he was 10 or 12, but she had a son. And she didn't want to vote against Santa Fe's history, so he wouldn't learn the truth. And Thomas talked about how important the truth is. And one of the reasons I love this documentary is because I think it tells the truth. But Carol's punishment for doing that wonderful vote of conscience was that the people that she expected to vote for them will cross the street when she comes by. They don't say hello to her. They ignore her. She lost her last her election that she went into to be back elected by 3 votes. She's paid the price. And it's a shock to the Japanese Americans who I tell this story to, that other people have suffered on behalf of the Japanese that suffered in the camps. And I think that's an important story, and I'm sorry Carol isn't here to tell you herself. But the community is healed. We now have signs where the camp is. I think that this film shows how Santa Fe and its situation can be an example for other communities on how to get together, how the 3 meetings that we had together where the 2 groups talked and we came up with a resolution and a suggestion for the city council. The city council voted 8-0 for the veterans proposal, but the question was, we hoped they would vote 8-0 for the Japanese American marker, but it's not a done deal, even though you recommend.
Gerard Martinez, who you saw in the film, he was very instrumental in setting up the community dialogues that happened. And I think that's the lesson of the story, is that there are, a lot of, we all see the parallels to what's going on today in our national scale, but, I would hope that, what they all said is that, yes, you venture emotions and you talk to each other, and hopefully you come to, it may take 4 years, but hopefully, people can start to talk and realize that we all want the same things. We all want a roof over our heads, food, clothing, shelter, and I think the parallels to what's going on today are quite apparent. And I think I would like to also to hear from the Bataan. I had hoped to get Margaret Garcia to talk, and what she revealed was that a group of Bataan veteran descendants were invited to Japan by the Japanese government last year. And they were treated very well. They were brought over first class, and they were given given a formal apology from the Japanese foreign minister, just last year. So it's an ongoing, I think, recognition that healing, and apologies are important, and it's never going to take away. I understand the pain. That the Bataan veterans went through, and I've talked, but let's hear more from you are representing the Bataan veterans.
So my name is Charles Martinez. I'm a retired, retired from the New Mexico National Guard, and I served as a historian for many years. I also used to work at the state archives. But I remember, I want to start off by mentioning, I've known about the existence of the camp probably for about 45 years. Whenever my dad would bring us from Espanola to Santa Fe to visit his family, he always pointed out to the area of Casa Solana and always said there was a Japanese camp there. And it always surprised me because I never saw any marker whatsoever. And that was, I think my wife and I finally went to see the marker a few years ago, so it was great to finally see that. But again, that was one, my dad would mention it almost every time that we came to Santa Fe, there was a Japanese camp there. And I know one of the things with the New Mexico National Guard that I want to point out, most of the time for World War II, they always talk about the 200th Coast Artillery that went to the Philippines. But there were 2 units that fought in Europe, the 120th Engineer Battalion and the 804 Tank Destroyer Battalion. The 804 Tank Destroyer Battalion, when they were in Europe fighting in Italy, fought with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which you see a picture towards the end. It was made up of Japanese Americans, but it was one of those units that, one of those pieces of history that they didn't really talk about that much. And the 804th was made up of people from all over New Mexico, but there were 2 units here in Santa Fe, and then there were some other units throughout the state, Roswell and so on. And then picking back off of what Tom mentioned about the Confederate veterans, I happened to be at the State Archive researching when, towards the end of the day, I think it was 4:30 or something before they closed, Richard Salazar, a historian, had come in. He had gotten a phone call, and I think he'd been out there all day, and he said, you should see what they just found at Glorieta. And that was, you know, I went back, read the newspaper, and they talked about the Japanese, I'm sorry, not the Japanese, the Confederate remains that they found. So,
I would like to just to correct that this was not a Japanese camp, you know. You see, it was a Japanese camp. There were American residents, you know.
that's true.
You know, I mean, I would prefer that term, because there were no Japanese prisoners of war in this camp in Santa Fe, none whatsoever.
Yeah.
You know, and people go, oh, it was a Japanese camp. No, no, the American residents. So I try to help, you know, change the vocabulary a little bit. You know, these are okay, alien residents of Japanese heritage, okay? They were forbidden to become, they were not allowed to become citizens back then. And it's just as the Chinese were not, it was a Chinese Exclusion Act, Asian Exclusion Act. So they were forbidden to become citizens, even though they lived here for decades, you know, and had land, and, you know, they so I just wanted to correct that a little bit. And yes, the 442nd, the Japanese American unit, the 442nd, was one of the most is the most decorated unit for its size, you know, for their bravery and courage. And they had more Purple Hearts, you know,
Than any other.
than any other for their size in
Yeah.
the war. So there were a lot of, my uncles joined the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service. And the Military Intelligence Service started in San Francisco before the war. But because after the war started, they were taken over, they went up to, I forget, Camp Savage. And, you know, they were not allowed to tell about their work because it was sort of secret. But they used, you know, there were stories of Japanese American soldiers who went behind the lines in Japan, you know, in the Far East, and they imitated the Japanese military. They shouted out orders and, you know, got a lot of Japanese soldiers killed, or they would intercept a lot of the messages. So they fought, you know, they fought for America. They wanted to really prove that they were Americans. So, you know, I just wanted to point out that, yes, even though they were serving, you know, the American government, their parents were sitting in prison camps all over the place in the country. But, you know, it was just, I just wanted to point that out too.
And thank you for that clarification. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was, and one last thing, when I was going to school at high school, St. Catherine's Indian School, when my art instructor, Bob Chavez, was a baton survivor. And I remember in classes at night after school, he would mention that a lot of things that he went through, but he wanted to make sure that his kids realized that his feelings towards the Japanese was his and his alone because of what he went through. He wanted to make sure his kids didn't feel the same way because he said, you know, we have to move on. But he said, you know, my pain was kind of like his burden. So thank you very much for the film.
Thank you. Yes, and I want to apologize for the pain. You know, I mean, I'm not responsible in any way. But of course, when you find out history, because as a high school, you know, you don't learn the really deep stories in American history. They don't really go very deep. You know, oh yeah, Japanese Americans were incarcerated, you know, prisoner of war. That's it. But you know, the baton, similar to the baton veteran story, I didn't until I came here and really learned about it. You know, I really began to appreciate. Oh my gosh, the pain. And so I wanted this film to show, you know, that side of the story too.
When I joined the committee, we didn't know who was in the camp. And there were articles about their being disloyal. And that's one reason why I wrote about it and did a lot of research on it. And Bill Nishimura, who you might have seen his picture in, that was in
There's a
the...
suitcase in there, yeah.
Yeah, I have Bill's given me his suitcase and his father's duffel bag. Now, can you imagine all that you own going into that suitcase, and it went to 3 different camps. That's not a big enough suitcase for me to pack for a weekend. But that is what he had, all that he could carry in one suitcase. And his father had a duffel bag. And so you're welcome to go and look at that. I wanted not to forget to invite you down to see it. And then we have a G.I. Joe doll that talks about the 442nd. I also want to introduce Sue Runstrom, who is sitting, she's always sitting, letting others speak for her, but she works very hard. Yesterday there was a huge program like this in Santa Fe, and she was very active in working on that. But Sue, you want to stand up? She was on the committee.
Yay,
She was one of those
Sue,
ladies. So she was on the committee with us.
I did want to mention a little bit about the Santa Fe camp people. You know, I said 4,555 men. Now, the first group of people were you know, like the Buddhist priests, I mentioned to some people, Buddhist priests and the community leaders. That was the first wave of men brought into Santa Fe. And meanwhile, after a couple years, in 43, the government had passed this, they were running short of people to serve in the army. Said, well, maybe we'll get the Japanese to serve. Well, how do we get them to come out of here? We have to do a loyalty test. They did a loyalty questionnaire, which was very faulty. But, you know, they said, okay, some guys say, oh, I'll volunteer. Well, the 2 questions, there were, are you a loyal American citizen? You know, or are you loyal to Japan? Yes, I'm an American citizen. Are you willing to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces? And some said, sure, I'll go join. And some said, I'll serve in the armed forces when you release my family from this concentration camp. And so then the government said, oh, you're a no-no. If you're considered a no-no, well, you're not really loyal if you want to, you know. So anybody who questioned authority were then pulled out of their family, you know, camps, put into Tule Lake. And then there were, so there was a whole group of people who resisted in their way. The only way they could protest was to say no. And then some of those were then brought to Bismarck and then eventually to Santa Fe. So it was a whole group of younger men who were brought, who said no, we're not gonna, you know. And so that's why you see.
And Bill was one of those, and he lost his citizenship. He didn't get it back till 1958, when I graduated from college.
Thanks to an ACLU lawyer who really fought, got thousands of men who were forced, or some of them just voluntarily said, okay, well, this country is,
Yeah, and so there was confusion among the articles that during this controversy time, who was in the camp? Well, I think Joe knew, and maybe you and Doc knew, but we didn't really know. We were, because people thought disloyal, they were disloyal. Well, then they must have been enemy, well, they were called enemy aliens by their title, by virtue of us going to war with Japan. So it's complicated and it's fascinating. And but between the time when we asked for the marker and these dedications at the marker itself, so much healing has happened, so many articles have come out, and books, and articles.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned pilgrimages, and a lot of Japanese Americans go on pilgrimages to where their parents were incarcerated during the war, as a way just to experience what, to see what they experienced. I've gone to Tule Lake, to Topaz, to see one of my parents. I actually marked out, for my other film, I drew out the 120 feet by, 20 feet, and marked out exactly what barrack they were in, and it really hits you, when you walk the same path. They were there for almost 4 years. You go, oh my God, it's a desert, it's horrible. But right now, today, there's a movement in the Japanese American community to go on pilgrimages. And I kind of want to, to me, it's like we go and there are memorials are placed at these sites. And I would like to see this marker changed to a memorial, because, not a monument, but a memorial. Because people, like Joanna said, my father was here, where is it? And people kind of want to go, well, it's a memorial marker there. I mean, it's in memory of the fact that there was an internment camp here in Santa Fe. And people go there, and it's very healing when you see people putting flowers at that stone. And that's a healing process. In the same way I think, and today I think what Gerard Martinez's line was that he said that, yes, they wanted a Baton Veterans Memorial in Santa Fe by the city, and he said some of the funds went to making the state memorial that you see in the film and you see in the town square of Santa Fe. But he would like to see a marker specifically for the Baton veterans at Fort Marcy. Fort Marcy. So, it's sort of a call to action if you want to help support some of the Baton veteran descendants, the memory, as another memory for them, a memorial for them, specifically as opposed to an inclusive, veterans, the state veterans. What do you think about that?
I agree, there probably should be one, but I think there should be one for all the veterans. I think but I would be interested in getting that done, getting that marker. One more thing I want to mention is the New Mexico Military Museum in Santa Fe. They've had a few flags that were Japanese flags that were captured from Japanese forces. I believe there were 2 ceremonies they've had within the last few years where they've done a ceremony to repatriate the flags back to Japan. There's a certain group that does it, I forgot what the name is, but yeah, and they're trying to do a few more. So.
That's wonderful, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the repatriation is an important issue in all museums now. Repatriating, the artifacts of the actual culture from which they came, whether it's Native American, objects that have been taken. And so I think it's looking at, when you learn the history of any place, I think you kind of, I was just at a national conference where of public history, and there is a big movement to repatriate a lot of, cultural artifacts now, and rightly so, I think, but anyway.
Well, I have the dilemma of where I'm going to, when I leave this earth, what am I going to do
The
with,
Japanese American National Museum,
State History Museum.
or the State History Museum, but okay. But Bill Nishimura served it.
and Sue said that the Japanese group in Albuquerque that I belong to also has just purchased land, so there could be another museum in Albuquerque. But Bill has entrusted me with his property and his father's property. And I have a dilemma on where should he go when I'm done giving talks and showing my show and tell. You want to comment on that?
Well, it all started with me as a museum director trying to get something in our collections that had
That's
something
right,
to do with
yes.
the internment camp. So if there was any disappointment in all this, is we still haven't received anything except for copies. We got copies from UCLA and stuff of the artwork, but real actual stuff hasn't happened.
Welcome to Joe Ondo.
And Joe knows that because he was part of this from the beginning, but Joe wanted to keep his stuff, and that's fine, his son has it now, I think. So including that photograph.
Yes.
I would love to have that photograph in our photo archives. And there's some others, so there's that. I want to make a comment. This isn't the elephant in the room thing, but this was a kind of a controversy that took place in Santa Fe 20 years ago now. And of course, all of you are close enough to our capital city to know that it's reeling in its controversies again over the obelisk and all of that stuff, right? I gave a talk in front of the obelisk 2 weekends ago, and I read the words that I'm going to paraphrase, that the people in 1868, when they laid the first foundation of that obelisk, basically what they said is, they said a prayer, essentially, that they wanted to do this in memory of all the men who had given their lives in protection of our community. That's what they said. So my proposal, we talk about memorials and markers and stuff for veterans. The obelisk should go back up and just paraphrase or use the exact same words. This is put up in memory of all the men and women now. And I mean that personally because I lost a daughter in the military. and men and women who have protected our community. You don't have to say who they fought or anything else, is that they made the effort and they gave their lives. And so that can happen too. I wrote about this a little bit, but I wanted to read. We got the approval, everything was up, we had the banquet, all the people that we were working with were happy, but there was still some bitterness in the community. I mean, they lost the vote, and I'll sit before you and say, if we'd lost the vote, I would have accepted that, but I also had felt some success because it was about history and education. And by doing this through the 4 years of controversy and then the seance sessions and the newspaper articles and giving talks about it, the community became aware of something that most of the people in Santa Fe didn't know existed. So, education is everything from my historian's point of view. And so it was going to be a win whether we lost or won that vote. And Doc Weaver, at the end, wrote a letter to Mayor Delgado, which I want to share with you. I don't think anybody's done this. It says, Dear Mayor Delgado, as I recall, it was almost 4 years ago when our committee met with you to discuss establishing a historic marker in commemoration, to commemorate the memory of the Santa Fe internment camp. Never in our wildest dreams did we anticipate it would be such a long journey. From that first meeting until the dedication on April 20th, 2002, many events along the way tested not only the committee, but the community as well. Both groups learned a lot about each other and gained immeasurably from the experience. Not only that, but we got a little history lesson along the way. And then the marker, the committee wrote that marker. And people forget that. It wasn't, the city didn't write that. We didn't leave it to this Parks and Recreation to come up with words. We wrote that, and I'm sure you remember.
It took 6 months for us to come up with that language.
Yeah, and it started with, Doc wrote the first draft, and it was, gave it to us, and we, of course, criticized them heavily and marked it up and put everything that we thought should be in the marker. So it turned out to be that we would have taken about 5 boulders. And so we pared it back down, and Joe Ando and I ended up doing the last editing of the thing. And the one thing that I know I wrote or insisted to be in the articles is the last line. And it is, this marker is placed here as a reminder that history is a valuable teacher only if we do not forget our past. So, done.
Bravo. Other questions?
Any questions?
John has.
An issue today is the role of the news media in the nation and what the nation does. Looking back, how would you rate the news media, the role of the news media at that time on that issue? Did they report fairly, you think? Did they affect the outcome by being fair or by being unfair? Do you have any comments on that?
Well, the newspapers, more than newscasts.
Yeah.
But the newspapers played a big role. I already told you that I used the New Mexican to publish that photograph for us. They published my article while I was writing for them. They asked me to do it as a historian. So that started the whole thing. The Santa Fe Reporter wrote some articles. I have to say that there was no opposition from the press to our idea at all. They
reported what the veterans said also.
They were represented in the Baton people were quoted in articles and from their position as well. In the end, I thought the press was fairly favorable. Of course, they didn't criticize me, so. But in the end, the Journal, the Reporter, and the New Mexican all wrote editorials supporting the project.
Yeah, I was very surprised
Yeah.
doing the research.
So that they never opposed it. I think the press reflected everybody, that was involved in this. All sides understood the position of the Bataan survivors. There was no question of that. And like I say, we had, our side was veterans too. We understood that. We know, I especially knew the history of the Bataan March. Actually, I helped the Guard do the Always Ready exhibit. I was their curator for them. And so that was, there was never any opposition to the Bataan Marchers per se. It was more of a positive thing to get something done. And that was reflected in the press.
Good to hear. Did you want to make a comment about it?
Okay, I have a couple comments and a question also. First of all, Claudia, congratulations. I think you've done such a good job of presenting both sides of the story and all the emotion that was involved, and are quite impressed with how you depicted the council hearings and whatnot. So it's very good, and I learned a lot just by watching your documentary. My father-in-law was a prisoner of war in Japan, and we have to remember it was more than just the march.
Yes.
It was 3.5 years of captivity and very difficult conditions, and so many of the men died during these. But like Tom says, my father-in-law had no lasting resentments toward the Japanese people. He was resentful toward some of the guards
Yes,
that really were horrible, but the people, he put that in the past. He didn't talk about it much until he was about in his 80s. And that's when he started writing down some of his memories. So it was very much appreciated by his family. The question I have is, in the documentary, it said something about, the German citizens weren't incarcerated, but I know there's a...
not in this one, not in Santa Fe. But
Well,
there
let
were
me just-
Germans put into in a couple. They were picked up like the German Bund with the right wing. What is the
There were
Bund?
German prisoners brought from Europe.
And they were prisoners of war. They had German ships that were here, and prisoners of war were put into German camps. So I want to make a distinction between the incarceration camps and the internment camps. And this was an internment camp run by the Department of Justice, as opposed to the one that my parents were in. And so there were German, prisoners of war in certain camps, and there were some Italians.
In New Mexico.
But not Americans, citizens of German
No,
heritage.
no.
Well, I just
There
want
might
to
have been a
pass.
few who were with the German Bundestag, were the German right-wing group, and they had a big, meeting in New York, I remember, and so they rounded up some of those leaders who were, for Hitler. And so if you're that vocal about your support for Hitler, then I think they rounded up a few of those guys and put them in internment camps. But there was no way did they round up a whole group of, because you were German and we were at war with Germany, did you?
I just want to pass on a family story.
Okay.
My wife's grandpa was a German citizen living in Santa Fe. He was very well known. He was the head chef at La Fonda. Okay, so he was really well known at the time. He was still a German citizen. He'd cooked for the Kaiser during World War I,
Wow.
and now here he's head chef at La Fonda. And at least the family stories are that certain individuals in town thought he should be incarcerated.
Wow.
Okay, and so what happened, a local judge, at least this way the story is, worked to get his American citizenship passed very quickly so that, that seemed to resolve the problem. But, I guess we'd like to do a little more research into that, but that's the family story that we know. So that there was even though not necessarily incarceration, there still was quite a lot of prejudice.
I mean, even some Japanese Americans who weren't on the West Coast,
Yeah,
they weren't put into the prisons, but they were treated pretty badly. I mean, I had stories of, kids going to school and they got spat on, by other
yeah.
students. So it's the racism and all that was, I'm sure for Germans and Italians at the time too, because we were at war. And, but Japanese look different. If you're German, you can blend in. Nobody's gonna know that you're German or Italian.
Yeah.
But we have these faces that make it impossible to blend
Not
in.
so easy, yeah.
But, we are, so it's interesting to hear those kinds of stories. Thank you. Any other comments?
Hey, what piqued my interest when I saw the flyer on it today and what it came is, I'm a veteran, and it said, you're battled by local veterans, and I was going, why would local veterans be battling this? And it just struck me as odd, and that's what piqued my interest to come. But I understand it better having seen your film, which I think is very well done. My question is, would any of you be willing to try to channel probably what would have been the most heartfelt opposition you heard that was feeling like this was somehow disrespectful to them or to their
You speaking
parents?
about the veterans you're talking
Yeah,
about?
that was an interesting thing, because it sounded like, as I understood it from the film, there was lots of listening done when this started becoming controversial. So there was it sounds like there was a lot of effort to listen to people and hear what they had to say. But I didn't see in the film, I didn't really pick up what would somebody who was really giving a heartfelt feeling that they had been disrespected, how did they explain how they felt disrespected by putting a marker on this internment camp, which to me, I have a hard time equating how those things relate to each other.
Well, I think it's just that they didn't understand that they were not prisoners of war. These were not Japanese, prisoners of war.
So they would stand up and say, "You're honoring prisoners of
Yeah,
war." That's what they would say.
Or you're honoring the Japanese, as if any Japanese face would represent the Japanese military. These were, they were innocent of any war crimes or anything. And so I think they just thought anything. I mean, if you suffered at the hands of the Japanese military, I imagine the psychological scars. Anytime you see a Japanese face, you're going to say, you're going to be against it. You're going to have feelings about, that. So I think there was a lot of misunderstanding that who were in these camps. And Tom had
A direct answer from my point of view is the most heartfelt, it wasn't a plea, but a conversation I had was not with one of the actual members of the Baton March, but one of their sons, who just felt that this was going to be very hurtful to his dad. And he really meant it. He really felt that. And so that's the one that resonated with me. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's kind of channeling one
Yeah.
of those.
The
It still don't quite
I
understand
never-
it, other than if he felt his dad couldn't really understand.
I hope that all of us have children that will defend us
Yeah.
in our older age, right? None of us are there, of course. And I appreciated that, but I never heard from one of the actual survivors of the Baton March. Outside of the 2 calls I received from 2 of them saying, we're not in opposition to this, but we're not going to speak out because we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Okay, so.
Tom, in that regard.
You gotta use a microphone.
But she has a question.
Oh, I didn't so much have a question, I just wanted to say, thank you for doing that, because when I moved here from California, which is where I grew up, and our next door neighbors were Japanese. And of course, we knew the grandparents of my friend who was my age, Grandma and Grandpa Ito, very nice people, and the Senekawas. And so Mrs. Senekawa was 15 years old, and they were visiting family in Japan. And so her parents, the Itos, and herself were visiting family and got caught over there. during the war, and she actually, as a 15-year-old, was an interpreter for the US government. But still, then when they came back from Japan, they had nothing. It was, I mean, they came back to nothing. All the property was gone. So, I mean, yes, again, they still only had a suitcase. Whatever they took on vacation, you know, that's what they had. And they actually went to the U.S. consulate. You know, they were like, "Oh my gosh, we're American citizens, you know, we're stuck here in Japan, on the other side of, you know, whose people were fighting." But when they my next door neighbor, she told us, and the Itos and Mrs. Senekawa would tell us these stories, and I couldn't believe it. I said, they put Americans in camp? I mean, Americans. Oh yes, but they're Japanese American. But I said, but they were Americans. Yes, they had nothing to do with the war. They were just plain old Americans. She was American born, and I just couldn't believe it, that we would put our own people in camps because they looked different, you know. And so I think it's great, because when I was in junior high school, we learned history, California history, US history, nothing in those history books said anything. And I asked my teacher, I said, excuse me, but did you guys forget to put something in those history books? Because there's nothing about you guys put Japanese Americans, but Americans, in these internment camps. So we didn't even learn about it. They were whitewashing over the whole thing. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. Yeah, you want to say?
So I was just remembering, years ago I spoke with Tony Reyna. I was speaking with Tony Reyna, and I don't know if you know, Tony Reyna was a survivor of the Bataan Death March. He was former Taos governor. And he told me, you know, he survived the Bataan Death March. He contracted he almost died. He was he worked in Japan, and he kind of did his best to sabotage military equipment as a worker by urinating on equipment and doing different things. And they kept him alive because he kind of looked Japanese, right? He had Native American Taos Pueblo features. So he survives the war, he comes back, and we were talking about the marker, and he said it was definitely not fair what they did to those people in Santa Fe, because they were Americans, right? And he also said he was racism, and he told me the story that when he came back, he wanted to start a jewelry store. And he went to the local bank in Taos, and they're like, no, we don't lend money to Native Americans. Wow. They didn't say that so nicely, but they told him that. And word got around he wanted to start a jewelry store, and a local businessman lent him money to start his business, and I think it operated till the day he died. But yeah, seeing the film and hearing Tom talk, I remember that conversation and him basically saying it was racism. And it was racism, what happened in Santa Fe is, unfortunately, after him surviving the Bataan Death March, he faced racism as well.
The people that were the men that were brought to the camp were brought in trains where the curtains were down. They didn't know where they were going, right?
Yeah.
Then there were different times. And then the 4,555 men in the camp wasn't all at one time. There were only enough beds for 2,200 or 100 for the last 2 years in the camp. So these men were processed. They were brought and then they were processed whether to stay in the camp or they would go down to Lordsburg. They closed Lordsburg and brought in the Germans and the Italian prisoners of war. So they sent the Japanese the men of Japanese descent, is the way I describe them, back to Santa Fe and enlarged the CCC camp so they could hold more men. And then, of course, as Claudia said, the no-no boys were brought down from Tule Lake in California, and then from other Department of Justice camps, and Santa Fe was the last camp to close. It closed in.
No, it wasn't. Sorry.
Not last internment camp.
Well, in New Mexico, but
Yeah,
when New Mexico was closed, as you saw in the film,
Yeah,
they were sent to Crystal City, Texas.
yeah.
And a lot of the women, the people you saw, the man who wrote all the haiku poems I have in my film, he was one of the no-no boys. He protested. In fact, his picture is a very famous historical photograph where you see the Tule Lake Jail. He's one of the first that were jailed in Tule Lake. There's a jail within a jail in Tule Lake. And then he was sent, and there were men who were sent to many of these. I've done interviews of a lot of people who were in these DOJ camps. And for some reason, they would move them. I mean, there's one, they were sent from Hawaii, they came to Angel Island, and then they were sent to 7 different camps.
Yeah.
7 different camps. So in this case, daughter Ina was sent from, he was a California resident, from Topaz to Tule Lake, and then to Bismarck, and then to Santa Fe, and then to Crystal City. And then Crystal City in Texas became a family. He finally got reunited with his family. He hadn't seen his daughter, who was. So when she first met her father, and he came to give her a hug, she cried. She says, "Who's this man?" The family separation, is an issue that we see today. And so there's a lot of Japanese Americans, and I belong to that group, Student for Solidarity, who are demonstrating in support of immigrants today who are being separated, from their families too. So, these issues are ongoing. We say, oh, history's, you don't want to repeat these mistakes in history, but they are being repeated. And as Japanese Americans, we feel we really have we should speak up for the people who are being separated today, families being separated. So, I filmed many demonstrations in front of these camps.
I'm wondering, I talked with Nikki about this, Nikki Lewis, who is a co-sponsor of this film, co-producer, excuse me. And we were talking about the fact that she and her daughter in Seattle were asked to go back where they belong. And they were both born in the United States. So what if we called ourselves American Japanese or American Africans rather than using the other nation?
Hyphenated Japan Americans.
Well, use the term American because they're American born and technically they're citizens by virtue of being born in the United States.
Yes.
So if you say the National Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles separates the community that wants to be included. And one of the things that happened in the camp was that the men became more associated with the culture of Japan by putting on kabuki type things and celebrating Japanese anniversaries than American. And yet, they felt pushed out by their own government. And Bill talks about how resented he was and he wanted to go to Japan. But then at the last minute, America told these internees they could stay. It's a long story. But we want to be inclusive. We're a mixture of all kinds of nationalities, all kinds of grandparents. So can we work towards that kind of changing the nomenclature? Just like you want to change the marker to something a little bit more memorial. I'm just throwing it out as an idea.
We in New Mexico probably know more than anybody about problems of identity. Right? Are you Mexican? Are you Spanish? Are you Latino? Are you this? Are you that? And they're, to me, first of all, American. Let's try this one on. You know, in the Hispanic-speaking world outside of this country, students are taught there's one American continent, not two. We're taught two, North and South America are different continents. Not in the Hispanic-speaking world. I'm talking about Spain and all the Latin American countries. And they all consider themselves American. Now, I married a woman from Argentina, and the first time before we were married, I invited her to this country, and she came to New York and met La Migra there, right? And they asked her if you're American, and she said yes. Took her off to the side and gave her a lecture about trying to fool an immigration officer, but she was right. She was right. And so then it gets to the definition of what is American? It's all of us. And we all have our identities, whatever our heritage is. And I would guess that if you get put in a camp, if I got put in a camp, all of a sudden I would fall back on whatever it is I grew up with. And want to maintain that and not let the gendarmes take it away from me. So it's perfectly natural to me that for the most part in this camp, except for the Thule group, these were elderly men. They were considered community leaders and therefore dangerous from the point of view of our government. And so these men were maintaining their identity in that camp with their art and their drama.
Yeah, baseball, American baseball.
Yeah, well, except for baseball. You know. But actually, Japan's better than us in baseball these days. So, at any rate, so they you know, you fall into yourself and you get into those kinds of situations, and want to maintain who you are. And if there's other people who are like you, well, then naturally you're going to do that kind of thing. It's very American to do that. That's what we are. We're all of us.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that comment. One more?
Oh, no,
Go ahead.
Okay. Did the U.S. government ever express any remorse officially for creation of these camps?
It took a long time, but the Japanese Americans at the time formed a redress movement. They said this was totally illegal to put 120,000 people in these prison camps. I mean, they've done nothing wrong, right? They just have the Japanese face. And so it took years and years, but Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii, Norman Mineta from California, there was a redress movement in the Japanese American community. They said, we want an apology from the government, and we want some redress. We've lost. I did an account. I sort of did a rough accounting. I mean, my grandparents lost their business. They were very wealthy before the war. My grandmother went to Topaz wearing her fur coat. I mean, go figure. And actually it was very handy in the desert at night. But, you know, the families lost, I mean, all of the land, the Central Valley. The Japanese turned the Central Valley into a garden. They brought the techniques of Japanese farming to America. And which was irrigation and all the other, you know, methods of farming. And they lost thousands of acres of land. They just got it taken away from them. Because, you know, and they never got, you know, so I figured there was like $5 billion worth of just property, not to mention, you know, all the other, you know, values that were lost. My grandparents lost their florists. My grandmother was an Ikibanas, and they knew a lot of flower growers in the Bay Area. And they all lost their businesses, you know. And so in 1988, it took 10 years of, you know, what happened is they had sort of like meetings, you know, they realized they had to educate the public of what happened in these camps. And so they had congressional hearings all over the country and the Japanese are very reticent to talk, you know, but they did, and they came up and said, this is what happened to me. And when people learned, you know, oh my God, they got this, you know, this land was stolen from them, they had this, they lost all that. And it took 10 years, but they eventually got, you know, a Civil Liberties Act passed in 1988. And they got a formal apology from the US government. My mom has one framed in her house, signed by George Bush. And they all got, you know, and those who were surviving, I mean, thousands and thousands of them had already passed. But they got a reparations check of $20,000 But when you consider the millions and billions of dollars that were really lost by this community, it was a token. And so Nikki Najima used her reparations money to go back to school and get her PhD. So it was, there was at least a token of an apology. And so that's why a lot of the Japanese Americans feel that they want to help other communities get reparations today too, because we all know what has been stolen. If Native Americans all got together, what could we get back to them? And it's maybe not the land, because of course I'd have to give back my house to the Native Americans who were there. But I'd be happy to help with education. They should get free education. They should get better, Anyway, there are a lot of measures that we want to support as the reparations today, just bringing to what we can help, other communities today. Thank you.
How involved the local citizenry that wasn't,
Messing up.
I'm curious how involved the local citizenry of Santa Fe that didn't kind of have direct connections to whether it be the Baton veterans or the Japanese American community. How involved did they and activated did they get through this whole controversy, and were there third bunches in there in terms of points of view or movements, so to speak?
Well, this is a good question. First of all, New Mexico and Santa Fe have a huge, I would say a disproportionate percentage that are veterans. For example, I don't know if you know this, but New Mexico has more Medal of Honor winners than any state in the Union per capita. And and this goes all the way back to, the Civil War, the Indian Wars, naturally, the Rough Riders who were recruited here by Teddy Roosevelt, all of that stuff, up through World War II, and Vietnam, and on. So there's all of that. And so the VFW and it was very big in Santa Fe. They were involved. I talked to them. I made a point of going to them. So I knew that. I knew that. And in Santa Fe, the people in Santa Fe get politically, maybe so politically motivated for things, and so they were paying attention. Now, what was interesting about this is, the side that was in opposition to us, the people of the Baton Marchers, and having their marker and stuff, those were the local people. The descendants of the internment camp weren't residents of Santa Fe. It was Doc and me and Aunt Joanna lived in Albuquerque at the time, and I was director of the museum. And then we had our local committee formed, but some of those came from out of Santa Fe too. So it was kind of, it was interesting in that, but it was never, there was no threat of violence, there was none of that. There was that one crazy colonel, he was even going to sue the city for holding illegal meetings with the city council. He was just that way, but it was generally a civil discussion.
I don't think there was ever any paint thrown on the marker either that was threatened.
The marker's never been in any way denigrated after 20 years now.
Gerard talked about having the police posted on that marker after it was dedicated for a certain time, because there was concern that something might happen that would be destructive. But I want to say here, and I say it with great humbleness, that none of these Baton Death March survivors were New Mexico National Guardsmen who were POWs for 3.5 years, would have come home without the atomic bombs stopping the war and America not invading Kyushu. Because in 1944, there was an order that went out to all the commanders of the POW camps to exterminate. Jennifer doesn't like me to use that word, but they were to be eliminated without a trace. And there were examples of our men being burnt alive in tent trenches that they dug themselves. So none of the 900 men from the 1800, and these are rounded off numbers, would have come home if we had invaded on November 1st, as was planned by the military to invade Kyushu. The men wouldn't have lasted that long. They were starving. And also, there was an effort in Japan for every citizens of Japan to kill an American soldier that would invade. It's a story that's sad, but...
I've never heard that story. But,
Oh, well, I come to my lecture in November,
well,
in May. No, well, I can send you material about it. But none of them would have come home because they would have been killed as prisoners of war. Oh, well, I'm very happy you haven't heard it, because I will
well,
I will
I'm
send
happy
you
to,
the
I'm happy to
information.
learn, but I have never heard that story.
It's getting near 4 o'clock.
Yeah,
We need to wrap up.
Any last questions or comments?
Stump us with one.
Well, we thank you for coming today, and I am delighted to see as many people here, because I know it's a really busy weekend for people, Earth Day and the concert and other things, kids preparing for finals, et cetera, et cetera. We thank you, and I hope you share what you've learned today with other people in your circles. And I thank Claudia for coming, staying in New Mexico and coming up here. She has 2 more opportunities to show the film, and
Yeah, so the film festival is on the 25th at 8, but it's at 8 o'clock, but at the Jacques Cousteau Theater. So if you want to share, anybody you think would like to come see the film then. And then in Albuquerque at the New Mexico Historical Society in Albuquerque.
and Tom
And
will
Tom.
be there.
And Tom, oh yes, and great Tom Chavez
He's
will be.
everywhere.
He's in great demand. That's a great story that I appreciate.
And we want to thank Charlie for coming.
Yes, thank you, Shorty.
So just one last comment, when John was talking about his father-in-law, out of the 1,816 men that went to the Philippines, John's father-in-law was the second to the last veteran alive. There's one more veteran still alive, he's 104. So,
And did he talk to you about his experience?
No, I haven't met him. I know he divides his time between his family in Costilla and in Colorado Springs. Yeah, he still makes appearances every once in a while.
So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.